Uh, I mentioned before that my view is that there's a permanent catastrophe in the world that is used by everyone who's in favor of big government and less freedom as an excuse to justify their ends. The biggest threat now, I think, has moved on from all sorts of others like limits to growth and global warming and AIDS and so on to inequality. This is the current favorite flavor of the month for anyone who wants less freedom and bigger and more government. And I'm going to cover a wide range of issues there. Later on, you will be getting a similar talk on the same subject, essentially, and I'm assuming in that, because it is an economist, that they will cover some of the economic arguments, so I'll just touch on that. I'm going to deal with some of the more sociological and political aspects of the inequality phenomenon. I'm also going to move quite fast. I say sorry to people for whom English is not a first language, because I want to cover a lot of issues, and I'm going to have to jump over issues, and if we can't address them during question time, then you can please approach me afterwards, because I'm going to have to use a lot of shorthand to get through my content. The Occupy Wall Street phenomenon is part of this phenomenon, and there was meant to be a nice image in the background, but for some reason in transferring it to this computer it disappeared, of one of the demonstrators saying that Wall Street is the cause of the problem of inequality in the world, demonstrating at Wall Street, and the issue with Wall Street is inequality, really, supposedly not the wealth of Wall Street. The first myth concerned is that wealth presumably causes poverty. That is an implicit assumption, that wealth causes inequality, and that poverty and inequality are usually two sides of one coin, Siamese twins, as if they are the same thing. They are not, and in fact you could have one without the other, and maybe one, for example, inequality is actually good for alleviating poverty. We'll see whether that is so in a moment with some data. And then there is presumed to be a problem with inequality. All of the celebrities in the world, from the Pope to Obama to David, political leaders all over, celebrities, media people say that there is this problem, and the problem, if you try and find out why it's a problem, is firstly they say inequality is unjust, regardless of whether it came about as a result of injustice, simply the consequences are supposedly unjust, and secondly that it supposedly will cause conflict, war and resentment and anger from the poor. There is, for what it's worth, no empirical evidence to that effect. On the contrary, whatever empirical evidence is available suggests quite the opposite, that inequality can't be shown to have caused any conflict. And Piketty, in his celebrity book, sold 2 million copies, the biggest selling book of its kind, one of the biggest selling empirical books ever, pegs the whole thing to one single riot in South Africa at the Marikana mine, and he says there was an example of the poor rising up against the rich. As it happens, I know a lot about it, was very close to it, and it had absolutely nothing to do with it whatsoever, and his entire thesis that it's a problem flows essentially from that one single incident about which he knows pretty much nothing. I've mentioned catastrophism in the world, all the types of catastrophism, one following another, and all of them used as an excuse for massively increasing the size and power of government and consequently reducing freedom. The one we're looking at today is, in my view, the current most dangerous and most popular, and the cause célèbre of the people who want to reduce freedom and increase government power and redistribute the wealth of people who own it. This new inequality catastrophism is quite interesting. It is Pope Francis and other religious leaders have said it's the biggest problem the world is facing. Political leaders, Obama, David Cameron, many others, European leaders have said it's the biggest problem they face, or one of the biggest. Thought leaders, Paul Krugman, Joseph Stiglitz, etc., all say the same thing. Business leaders at Davos addressed inequality as the biggest problem they face, meaning that there shouldn't be as much, not that they are threatened by it, but there should be less of it. UNICEF and other United Nations agencies. Thomas Piketty, who's become somewhat of a rock star, sold 2 million copies of his just short of 700-page treatise, which is quite intimidating and quite daunting, and one of those things people buy in vast quantities and then use as a doorstop. Very few people actually ever read it, but they all seem to know about it. They don't even get to read something as simple and short as the Communist Manifesto, which is itself an interesting phenomenon. The problem of inequality, according to UNICEF, for example, is that the richest 20% get 83% of global income, with just 1% for the poorest 20%. That is a problem. Now, they don't say why it's a problem or what is problematic about it. It is just presumed to be a problem because the numbers are somehow impressive or curious or interesting, but it's supposedly a problem. And I'm going to get to why, by the way, I think people who call this a problem are morally very, very severely bankrupt. There's an ethical issue involved which is very serious indeed, which is that all they ever talk about is the rich and the difference between the rich and the poor, and never about the poor. They have no interest in the poor whatsoever, and that is going to be the one idea I want to leave you with. I will discuss the poor, and which they ignore. It will take 800 years at current rates, according to UNICEF, for the bottom a billion people in the world, the bottom, what is that, about a quintile or sextile, to have 10% of global income. In other words, they say the opposite of Piketty by implication. Those of you who don't know Piketty, his view is that inequality is increasing. Their view is that it's decreasing, and that it will take 800 years for the bottom group to get 10%. So there is some difference of opinion amongst the people singing in the same choir. They're not singing the same song. It is disturbing, they say, that the prevalence of children amongst the poorest, approximately 50%, are earning below $2, the $2 a day poverty line. That itself is interesting. The poverty line was originally drawn at $1 a day, and if you inflation adjust it, it's about $1.24. It suddenly leapt to $2, and there's a secret as to why it suddenly leapt to $2. Because, in fact, very, very few people are still poor as originally defined, which we will see. So they've just redefined poverty conveniently. But note that they're not worried about the fact that children are earning at all. Why should children be earning? They're against child labor in the first place. So it's interesting that they lament how little children earn rather than that they earn anything at all. And by the way, the difference in income between young people and old people is bigger than the difference in income between the top and bottom 20%. In other words, personal growth in income exceeds income inequality within countries and across continents. Andrew Hussey, prominent writer, journalist, media commentator, analyst, says Wall Street was right, capitalism has failed the world, and Piketty has explained to us why. Well, has it failed the world? Let's see. Free markets are the place to which the poor migrate. They migrate always in only one direction, from less free markets to more free markets. There's something the poor know that the intellectuals apparently don't know, which is that it's better to be poor where some other people are rich. It's better to go where the richest people are and where there is, by definition, therefore, greater inequality, which is lamented by the majority of intellectuals. The rich countries have the capitalism has the richest poor people. I think it was Walter Williams who worked out that if black Americans, considered America's poorest or amongst the poorest, were a separate country in the world, they would have something like the 10th or so highest per capita income in the world. Whatever the figure is not really particularly important. The principle is that poor people in rich countries are amongst the richest people on earth. Being poor in America now means you have only 3 color TV sets and you don't have the latest iPad. Productivity, the productive, the free markets produce virtually all technology and innovation. I'm going to try to say a bit about technology because I think this renders monetary and nominal inequality pretty close to irrelevant. It should no longer matter what monetary differences are because of technology, and some of you might not like to hear this, but it's objectively true. The welfare state renders monetary incomes and ownership of capital close to and increasingly irrelevant. The free markets provide most welfare. Their highest welfare levels are in the freest economies, and they accumulate most of the capital which they want to redistribute to the people who don't have it. And this is called failed. So it's some kind of failure. If that's failure, well, then we should all prefer to fail. The problem of inequality, according to Piketty, is it's a source of conflict. Now, he mentions in his chapter, his opening lines, his opening paragraphs, opening chapter is about the Marikana strike in South Africa. What that was about was entirely and completely a conflict between two trade unions fighting each other as to who would represent the workers on the mine. It had absolutely nothing to do whatsoever with the Lonman company that owns the mine or the income of the chief executives of the mine, and Piketty asserts without any authority or knowledge whatsoever that the purpose of the unrest was to fight against the fact that the CEO was earning too much of a big salary, which was not the case at all, apart from which the CEO can be the greediest and most selfish person in the world. He had absolutely nothing to do with what he was earning. That was decided by the remuneration board of the company. That is, the owners who would pay him, the people who pay him decided to pay him that amount. And so even if Piketty were right, it would actually have nothing to do with the CEO at all. And it's particularly interesting because the percentage and proportion of voting shares now owned directly or indirectly by workers through various institutional investments and pension funds and medical schemes and others, retirement annuities, is now a majority voting share. In other words, they could go to one of the meetings and they could actually fire and replace the CEO, and so they, by implication, endorse the CEO. So Piketty is simply factually wrong, and that is his only evidence that there is supposedly a problem, is that this mine, which had absolutely nothing to do with it whatsoever. They impute anger, resentment, violence, revolution, even war to inequality, and produce zero evidence or misconstrue available evidence. In other words, if there happens to be a war between a country that's richer and a country that's poorer, they say the war is because one of the countries is poor, as if one of them being rich caused the other one to be poor. There's always this implicit assumption that if Hugo is richer than me, then I'm poor because of him. He caused me to be poor. And well, I like that thesis, so maybe I'm going to reconsider after this talk, because it suits me actually for that to be true. But if someone is poorer than me, there won't be many of you, then I'll go back to my original position. The rich are, by the way, far from a source of anger and resentment. They're a positive externality. The poor love the rich. They watch soap opera, they watch TV, they're pop stars, they're music stars, they're sports stars, they're heroes. They never ever complain about the fact that they are worth billions. When last did you hear a poor person who watches Oprah Winfrey complain about the fact that she's a multi-billionaire? The poor love the rich. The idea that they hate and resent the rich is simply not true, which is clear from, for example, the popular media and television programs and much else. The people who demonstrate in Wall Street are not the poor, not even the poor by American standards. By world standards, they are amongst the wealthiest people in the world. So what is it that they're objecting to? Probably themselves. The attack on capitalists is that the top celebrities earn twice as much as the top 10 or 5 or 1 percentile of CEOs, whichever number you use, roughly double. In some cases, it's tenfold. So that nobody ever complains about what the celebrities earn or have or own. And by celebrities, I mean authors, TV people, sports stars, pop singers, and so on. Ted Turner, for example, 20 billion sings Castro's praises in Cuba. Ashton Kutcher, 750,000 per episode, and so on. And I'm just going to run through this. Huffington Post, by the way, which agrees with Piketty in its editorials, says on the other hand that when a pop star, Robert Downey, earns $75 million, that's to be congratulated rather than lamented. So when some people get very rich, it's considered okay. When people get rich by saving and investing and creating jobs and technology, that's considered bad and evil. Michael Douglas, who played the evil Gordon Gekko, got paid $85 million for 7 movies, Oprah Winfrey, and so on. I can go down all of the list of how rich the celebrities are that nobody ever complains about. Ken Follett, for example, one of the most popular fiction writers in the world, got paid $50 million before he started writing his forthcoming book in order to induce him to do so. Nobody complains about that. In fact, he is a big socialist and a supporter of the British Labour Party and considers himself to be opposed to inequality, where is one of the greatest manifestations of it. So what they're really concerned about is pulling down the rich rather than helping the poor. It took me a long time to get the birds to do that, by the way. Now, this I want to leave with you. It is said that a good address is one where, if you're asked 6 months later, what did the speaker say? If you can remember one thing the speaker said, that is unusually successful for a presentation. So I'm going to help you and tell you which thing to remember. It's this thing. So when somebody says, what did Leon Louw say? You say that Leon Louw said that we have just witnessed and are witnessing the greatest achievement of humanity ever in history. And that is the virtual elimination of poverty. It is quite interesting that as we come to the end of poverty on the planet, by its objective definition of $1 a day, inflation adjusted, that this is when we have inequality at its fever pitch. It's quite strange, quite paradoxical. What we should be doing is celebrating the end of poverty and destitution. Those of us here with grey hair can remember when typical TV news programs were programs of people starving in Biafra, Ethiopia, Chad and elsewhere, Bangladesh, and with children with kwashiorkor. The younger people here have never seen that, simply because starvation rarely exists. It's almost non-existent on the planet now, perhaps in North Korea and 1 or 2 other places. But it's pretty much vanished. And what has happened since 1970 is when the first objective definition was adopted under the influence, amongst others, of Jimmy Carter, is that just below a third of humanity was considered poor by that definition. If you inflation adjust it, it's now below 5%. And at the current rate, if it continues by 2050, there will not be anyone left on Earth. Now, I'm sure it won't quite get there, but it will be pretty close to zero poverty left. Now, that is an astonishing achievement. It is absolutely amazing. And you think Piketty, you think all the people who carry on about poverty even know that? Do you think they ever talk about it, ever write about it, ever mention it? They are disinterested. They are obsessed with the rich. They couldn't care a darn about the poor. And I think this is reprehensible and despicable and disgusting. They do not care about the poor, and much of what they recommend will slow down the rate of the spectacular alleviation of poverty in the world. During that period over there, when we used to see masses of starving, millions of starving people, destitute people, it's virtually vanished from the planet. This is, I'm not going to go into much detail, but it shows you the shift over time of the proportion of people in certain income brackets, and you can see that more and more people, bigger and more egalitarian distributions are occurring, and more people are earning higher and higher incomes on the planet. We can look at that later if anyone is interested. The global distribution of income distribution, according to the World Health Organization, the quality of and life estimates show that the differences between rich and poor have been closing. The happiness index estimates, of which there are about 3, show the same thing. Whether these indices really measure something is not important, but certainly to the available empirical data shows that there is a convergence between the living standards and quality of life and the rich and the poor. There's a kind of prosperity denialism. No one mentions it, no one says it, and I would be surprised if more than 3 or 4 of you in this room even knew that poverty has virtually been eliminated from the planet in the last few years. So they really do not care at all. This is the Pikettys of the world and what they think about the poor. So let's look at the concept of equality. It's interesting that the concept of equality, the inequality junkies as I call them, are obsessed with money. They are concerned with monetary inequality, which is increasingly irrelevant. It matters less and less and less because of technology and welfare and other aspects, low cost of products and falling prices and higher real incomes relative to what can be purchased. The income gap is an illusion. I'm going to try and cover that and tell you why. And unequal quality of life is declining. Freer markets, the rich get richer and the poor get richer faster, by and large, typically, and the poor enrich the rich. I just want to go back to that briefly to make this point, that the money the rich have was given to them by the poor because most rich people have made things that the poor use. So there are now more cell phones on Earth, active cell phones on Earth, than human beings. 75% of human beings have cell phones. That's pretty much all human beings who would want one. In other words, very young people and very old people and a few very, very poor people don't. But pretty much everyone now has the software that has been created and the billions of dollars made by the people who produce this technology are the money that was given to them voluntarily by, she says I have only 1 hour left. So I want to just go into the various definitions of inequality are somewhat problematic, and I'm going to move on quickly to show you that what we are interested in is equal rights and equal opportunities and equal contests, not equal outcomes. Also, just on the question of inequality, I'm going to leave you just quickly with a thought. Just tell me under which conditions these two people would be considered equal. Would they be equal if they have the same amount of money, or would one of them have to have a lot more money than the other? Money does not actually tell you very much about whether people are equal. One of those is intelligent and the other is a bit dumb, but that's a different matter. I would have said something about the Gini coefficient. I'm going to skip past it except to show you this. There you can see a huge, big difference and big fluctuations in inequality as measured by the Gini coefficient, which, by the way, only tells you very little about inequality, not very much, but that's a different thing. That is the typical graph you will see. This is what you get if you have the whole graph, which basically means that pretty much all countries in the world are close to the same. If you leave out the top and the bottom, you create an illusion of big differences. It's a standard technique and trick that is played in statistics. This is the inequality compared to the economic freedom index of the world, and you can see it's pretty much random, but to the extent there is a difference, freer economies are slightly more equal. The income gap, I'm going to try to summarize this very quickly. I can send someone the index, but what this really means is that if a poor person starts with $100, a rich person with $10,000, and the poor person's income grows at twice the rate of the rich person, the income gap will grow. So in other words, even if the poor get richer faster, the income gap grows. That is because people are getting rich. If people get rich, the income gap grows. That is simple, straightforward arithmetic. And so it should be. Let me move on through this. There's some interesting stuff here. That is the graph, by the way, showing that there's no real correlation, but to the extent there is, it is in favor of freer economies have slightly more equality. I want to move on to, well, there's one of my pretty pictures. If you forget what I say, at least remember the pictures. This is the rich creating jobs and feeding the poor with money that they earned or got from the poor in the first place by serving them. This is taking quicker than I thought.
I just want to be sure you know that that time includes, it doesn't include the question period. So you
yes, when we started 10 or 15 minutes late, has that been taken account of?
No, we can get
okay. Okay, well, if I just don't explain everything, you'll just have to walk forever in darkness, which is your problem. the rich and the poor are statistical concepts, not actual groups of people, and this is really one of the things I want to get into. Technology has rendered monetary capital and income increasingly irrelevant, and there is a convergence of quality of life or the amenities of life or living standards taking place in the world, what we might call the amenities of life. To give you an example, until the 19th century, only the rich had lighting, and then it was candles and lamps, oil lamps and so on, or fires. In 1960, 1 hour of labor bought 1 hour of light. By 1992, 1 hour of labor, typically, I think this is probably United States data, 8,000 hours of light. So just understand the same quantity of money buys a lot more. Economists are interested in how this varies. For example, there's one area where the same quantity of money in real terms, inflation adjusted, hour of labor, etc., buys about the same. That is haircuts. That's just as labor intensive as they've been since ancient Egypt. But pretty much everything else is now cheaper because of technology making it cheaper and more readily available. So instead of having to go around looking for and running the risk and having all the tedium and difficulty of lighting, the poor now simply flick a switch, and this is rapidly becoming universally available around the world. Barun Mitra was telling me that in India there is now more electricity than there is demand for, and the energy companies are begging for money. She says, I have only another 30 minutes now. 50 years ago, the poor had no motorized transport. Those are our parents or grandparents. Just understand this. 50 or 100 years ago, the poor walked. The rich poor might have had a donkey cart. Now they have motorbikes and they have buses and they have trains and they all have basically access to motorized transport. The same principle is true of almost everything else, which has become available to the poor in spectacular quantities at a spectacular rate. The alleviation of destitution or objectively defined poverty has been unbelievable. It is something that should be celebrated, and to even talk about inequality, it actually shows, I think, a morally reprehensible attitude towards the poor. I really do believe that. Everything has got better for the rich, and just some brief comments on Thomas Piketty and his famous book. The book, he says himself, he calls himself, I've got a great quote of his in which he says, I am a free market capitalist, I am for free markets, etc. But his entire book and everything he writes, and pretty much everything he says, is clearly within the Marxist paradigm, the Marxist idea of capital, or a sort of modern version of that, sort of crypto-Marxist. I want to recommend to everybody Deidre McCloskey's 55-page definitive review. I think it's fair to call it the definitive review of Piketty. Everyone interested in the subject should look at it. She basically points out that he's misdefined capital. For example, he includes land and housing prices, where the same land and house has gone up a great deal in price for various reasons and appears to be more wealth, but in fact it's still the same piece of land and wealth and much else. But she points out that within countries there might have been increases in income equality, but I repeat, spectacular decreases in inequality regarding the quality of life, the amenities of life. Those have increased almost to the vanishing point. In other words, the way a poor person lives now is very little different from the way a rich person lives. Maybe riding in a car instead of a bus, maybe living in a big house instead of a small one, and so on. As between, if you add developing countries, however, even then, as she points out, inequality is declining. There's some nice quotes from her, which I'm not going to have time to read to you. Just trust me that they're worth reading and that they're brilliant, and I found them. So if we expose Piketty, there are a couple of things I'm going to say about him. One of the most startling ones is that his most exciting times in world history are immediately following wars. After the First and Second World War, when all capital was wiped out and there was a great deal of equality, at least as far as capital is concerned, he was thrilled. He considered that to be absolutely wonderful, and he's totally distressed by the fact that the numbers went back to pretty much earlier levels. So in a way, what Piketty is really saying, although he doesn't spell this out, is what we just need is every now and then we need a world war to get equality back again. and to stop this business of some people getting rich and others not. There are all sorts of economic theory critiques of his R is greater than G, meaning the net rate of return on capital is greater than the growth rate, therefore the rich, according to him, are and will always get richer. For what it's worth, he has pretty much refuted himself on that, or at least qualified it to say he didn't really mean it. Then there are various academics. Even, by the way, what's interesting is George Stiglitz has even come out in criticizing Piketty's theory, and Robert Lucas regards this tendency to talk about inequality as one of the greatest threats and dangers now facing us, one of the worst things that's happening. So there's a lot that could be said about Piketty. I think you'll hear a bit more about it later, but I would like to say that there are all sorts of things that are very, very disturbing in what he writes. He, for example, regards, so he uses standard seductive econometric methodology, for example, saying that there's income from labor and income from capital, which is standard economics. However, it just completely overlooks the fact that the people who earn more from labor in rich countries earn more from labor because they have access to the capital of the people with capital. And I think there's a greater mix between owners of capital earning income from labor and vice versa than the standard techniques let us realize. They say something else, which is important, something different. So his solution, and the solution that everyone is loving at the moment, is to have massive amounts of tax on capital. In fact, he would like to ideally get rid of all other forms of tax and tax only capital. In other words, he wants to tax only the wealth that people create and accumulate. He particularly hates wealth that is left to someone by way of inheritance without one word or sentence about why it is that the person accumulated the wealth in the first place, if not to be able to leave their descendants. What you would do if you stop the ability to inherit through innovation, technology, savings, capital, thrift, and so on. He does not consider wealth is some kind of thing in the abstract that there's just lots of and should be redistributed in different ways, particularly by tax. He particularly believes that capital in the hands of government is just the same as capital in the hands of the original owners of capital. There is absolutely no difference. Capital just earns income, according to him, and therefore more should be owned by the government. He's absolutely against any form of government borrowing. He says instead of that just further enriches the people with capital because the government pays them back and pays them interest. Instead of borrowing, government should simply tax. It shouldn't borrow the capital, it should take the capital. And that's his view. His view is governments own no wealth, because he points out that in most cases the national debt is the same as the national assets. So he uses all sorts of trickery and sleight of hand to lead to the conclusion that basically all wealth and all capital is owned by 1 or 2% of the world's population. And everything else, everyone else owns, their personal possessions, their houses, their furniture, their pension schemes, their medical schemes, their savings, their bank accounts, their clothing, their jobs, their capital, intellectual capital, and all of that is simply to him worth nothing. He just writes it off as having no value whatsoever. So there's a lot there, and that brings me to the end of my talk. I think I'm pretty much on time. That was my full 1.5 hours, and that is, in my view, how the people who carry on about inequality feel about the poor. They don't give a damn about the poor. They don't mention them. They don't write about them. They don't look at their quality of life. They don't look at the fact that they now have painkillers. And probably the single most important statistic, which was in there somewhere, but I skipped over it, and I just want to raise this with you, is life expectancy. That in 1970, the life expectancy of the poor in the world, the bottom 30% then, was in its 20s. The life expectancy of the rich has always been about 70 years, and 70 years has crept up very slowly to 75, 80, but the life expectancy of the poor skyrocketed, is catching up. It's now 60, 65, and so that tells you that the poor now have food, they have medical care, they have painkillers, they have surgery, they have TV, they watch the world's best entertainers and sports events live in full color, whereas as little as 50 years ago, only very, very rich people would very rarely, for example, watch a World Soccer final. Now billions of people watch it around the planet simultaneously. The rate at which the rich have caught up and the poor are catching up to the rich is spectacular, and really to carry on now about inequality is, in my view, completely morally reprehensible. Thank you.
Looks like we have about five minutes for questions. Very quickly, Leon, does Piketty give any attention to the tremendous role that government plays in taking money from the poor and giving it to the powerful, such as agricultural subsidies or trade protectionism?
Does Piketty mention how much money the government takes from the poor and gives to the rich, such as, for example, import duties and excise duties and consumption taxes and so on and so forth? He doesn't. On the contrary, he presumes that pretty much everything governments take is taken from the rich, which you have to do if you want to make the case for taking more. He does mention, interestingly, that in about the 1900s, the government share of GDP was about 5% and is now in the advanced economies about 40%. That is a fantastic growth in the size of government, bearing in mind it was 5% of small economies, now it's 40% of big economies. And he goes straight on, literally in the same paragraph, or the next paragraph in which he makes that point, to say, therefore, markets are causing this inequality in the world. In other words, he says, governments have grown spectacularly as a proportion of GDP, but they're not to blame for anything that goes wrong. And he presupposes that governments take everything they take from the rich and they just don't take enough.
Okay, thank you. My name is Iqbal. I'm from Indonesia. I want to ask you about what if the government worsen the inequality by I read the papers about inequality and some policies that fuel subsidy worsen the inequality because the poor gets more than the rich. The rich get more subsidies than the poor. And what if the minimum wage? Minimum wage, I think it causes inequality too, because the formal sector, when the price is increased, there will be more supply in the informal sector, because Indonesia is almost 50% of the people are in informal sector. So I think inequality can be used by what if there is policy that worsen the inequality? That's my question. And the second is, what if it is done by helping the poor, not stopping the rich? What is your opinion about that? And in my city, this is a very, very interesting. In Bandung, in Indonesia, poverty is increasing, and inequality is increasing too, and the growth is so high. What if that happen? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, there are two sets to that question. The second one, I'll have to remind myself what the first was. The second one, you say that in Indonesia poverty is increasing and inequality is increasing. Bearing in mind that if you define poverty, which is usually how it's defined, as being less wealthy than the rich. In other words, if you say, compared to a billionaire, a millionaire is poor. Okay? So Hugo here is poor compared to Bill Gates, but compared to me is rich. And the workers in the kitchen compared to me are poor. So if you define as by poverty simply being poorer than someone else, well then of course, if the rich get richer...
It's about below the poverty line.
No, I don't know about Indonesia particularly, but if that's true, it would be extremely unusual. It's not happening around the world. I strongly suspect that the poverty line has been redefined. It gets moved up arbitrarily. I doubt very much that there are people in Indonesia who are worse off. The poor have less quality of life now than they did, for example, 10 years ago. It's almost impossible. I want to even say I'll place bets on it, like Julian Simon, that it's not possible. I bet that the poor in Indonesia now have more square meters of housing, more of them have running water, more of them have electricity, more of them have motorized transport, they have bigger consumption expenditure on clothing, more of them have fridges, more of them have television sets, radios, cell phones, and so on. I doubt very much that the poor in Indonesia are poorer. That would be extremely strange and so rare that I will bet against it, real money.
Okay, that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you so much, Leon Louw.